Everyone, this is a review video for basically chapters 1 through 3 of Mill's Utilitarianism. The exam will be on chapters 1 through 4, but this video will only cover chapters 1 through 3. Basic ideas of Mill. It's just maybe me just thinking through what I think are the key concepts, the key themes, key points that I think you should be ready to talk about. This review is not exhaustive. That is, you have to read the text and listen in class. That's preparing for the exam. So I don't expect this video to cover everything that might be on the exam. I don't think that just watching this video will prepare you. But if you've already done the work of reading the text and listening in class, this should help. So let's think about it. I mean, the first chapter, I think the key idea is what he calls a criterion of right and wrong. That is what it will be presenting in this book. It's the key idea, I think. But thinking about what sort of thing that is, and his criterion of right and wrong will be the greatest happiness principle. But having a notion of what that is, what does it mean to have a criterion of right and wrong? There's different ways of putting it. The criterion of right and wrong, he said, would also be the foundation of morality. Or you might say a moral standard, or the summum bonum. Oops, that's not it. He uses these expressions more or less interchangeably. I think the criterion of right and wrong is the key one, though, right? The idea that what we need in morality to make sound moral judgments is some sort of standard or criterion by which such judgments can be made, according to which such judgments can be made. So the criterion of right and wrong would be a standard or, yes, a principle that we could refer to make moral judgments. Somebody does something and we want to say whether it's a right action or a wrong action. A criterion of right and wrong would be a rule according to which we would make such a judgment. It's important to see that there are any number of candidates for what could be the criterion of right and wrong. Of course, Mill's would be, did the action promote happiness to the greatest extent? Did it prevent unhappiness? Or did it cause unhappiness and prevent happiness? That would be the criterion by which we would judge the value, the ethical value of the action. But there could be others. A divine command theory would be, well, what does God think? Does God approve of the action? Then it's right. Would God disapprove of the action according to what we can sort of glean of God's intention? Then it's wrong. The categorical imperatives are, to a certain extent, such a criterion of right and wrong. Was the person treated as an end in themselves? Was the rule by which the actor acted capable of being universalized so it could stand as a law for everyone? Those are criteria of right and wrong. So Mill recognizes that, yes, he has an answer to what the criterion of right and wrong is, but it's not the only possible candidate. What was the other big point from chapter 1? I'm sorry, I'm blanking for a moment. Oh, yes. Well, okay. So I say the other big point in chapter 1 is basically, everything's going wrong here. What does it matter? That is, what does it matter whether we know the criterion of right and wrong, or the first principle of morality, or the foundation of morality? There are plenty of fields, what he would call sciences, in which it's all but irrelevant. That is, the foundations or first principles or basic criteria are irrelevant. And he gives the example of algebra, basically saying it's one of those fields in which, we don't really need to know its principles to do it, to apply it. I think he suggested nobody really knows its principles. Nobody's been able to come up with a coherent version of them. But that doesn't mean that we can't do algebra and we're not confident in it. But what he's saying is morality is different. We can't make a single step in morality without knowing what our end or purpose is. Example, I mean, if say that I am say I'm in charge of deciding who gets fed during a famine. How would I make and I'm deciding what the ethical thing to do is. Is the ethical thing to do to try to feed everyone? Is the ethical thing to do to divide the food equally, even though that means that we'll all starve? Maybe I would do the latter if I was a Kantian, right? Because then I would just be avoiding using a person as a means. Maybe I would do the former if I were a utilitarian, because I was trying to salvage the greatest happiness. So it really does matter, Mill is saying, what we decide the foundations of morality are, the first principles of morality, because without them, we can't make a single step. That's not true of most fields, mathematics, science. You don't need to know the first principles. But for morality, because it has to do with purposes, you do. So those are the two big, I think, issues in chapter 1. In chapter 2 that's where he actually presents his candidate for the criterion of right and wrong, and that's the greatest happiness principle, which he uses synonymously with the idea of the principle of utility, or what he calls principle of utility. Same idea. Same thing. In his mind, those are the same thing. What is that? More actions. That's the principle. That's the actual criterion of right and wrong. But immediately he tacks on a definition of happiness. Which complicates things quite a bit. But this is the criterion of right and wrong. This is how we judge whether an action is right, whether or not it promotes happiness or causes unhappiness, whether or not it avoids pain or deprives people of happiness. That's the basic idea. That's the criterion. And then we have a definition of happiness and unhappiness. Basically, happiness is pleasure. Basically, unhappiness is pain. So that latter part of it is what he immediately goes into the defense of. That is, he's not defending the idea that happiness is the greatest good. He's which is tantamount to saying that pleasure is the good, the greatest good, which identifies his utilitarianism immediately as a form of hedonism. Anything that says that pleasure is the good, the greatest good, the point of life is, by definition, a hedonism. So hedonism has a kind of a bad name. People think it's degrading. People think that the objection is that to say that pleasure is the good is to say that we are no different from the animals. Maybe we're not, right? But Mill does think we are different from the animals, and he thinks that this criticism that pleasure, that hedonism or his form of utilitarianism is somehow degrading, is to misunderstand things and to seriously neglect the kind of pleasures that differentiate human beings and animals. So if the objection is to say that pleasure is the good puts us on the level of animals, Mill's response is that human pleasures are, some of them, different in kind to animal pleasures. And we should always keep in mind that we do share pleasures basically with animals. We would imagine basic bodily pleasures. Although even though those are different, but they're the same in kind. But his big point is that see, there are some pleasures that animals are not capable of. What are his examples? The pleasures of the intellect, the feeling and imagination, and he says the moral sentiments, which is a little odd, but I think to keep it simple, I would concentrate on the pleasures of the intellect and the pleasures of the feeling and imagination. And his point is that these pleasures are not only different from animal pleasures, that no human life would be complete, would be happy as a whole without them. That is, no one would choose to live without these pleasures of the mind, the cultivated feelings, the imagination. No one would want to live a life without them, no matter how much physical gratification we experience. Because these pleasures, he says, these, let's call them the higher pleasures. Because he says these higher pleasures are more pleasurable, more desirable, more pleasurable than the mere pleasures of the body, let's say. So he says there's nothing degrading at all. There's nothing demeaning at all about saying that pleasure is the point of life, the end of life, the purpose we all follow, the good. Because if you think about the kind of pleasures that we regard as the most important ones, they're not degrading at all. They're the pleasures that make us human, or the activities that make us human, rational activity, our feelings, our creativity, our imagination. I mean, he is thinking about things like reading. He's thinking about things like enjoying drama. He's thinking about creative activity. He's thinking about music. He's thinking about literature and poetry. He's thinking about culture. And without these higher cultural pleasures, you might call them, we really wouldn't be very happy. I mean, if we were deprived of them. It's not that we don't need the physical pleasures. Of course we do. But that would be an incomplete description of a truly happy human life. But about this last claim, that the so-called higher pleasures are more desirable, more pleasurable. I said more pleasurable twice. Let's say desirable. Then the lower pleasures, what justifies that? And his answer is preference. If you ask anyone who has experience of both, the higher and lower pleasures, they will almost invariably, he says, tell you that they prefer the higher ones. That is a claim. It may or may not be true, because that's just a claim, right? But that's his claim. Just ask anyone who's familiar with the pleasures of the intellect, the feeling and imagination, and the moral pleasures, you might say, the moral sentiments, and ask them if they're more pleasurable, more satisfying than the bodily pleasures. Then he says they will almost invariably say yes, they are. So all this leads to the famous thing that he says, which I've emphasized more than once. I might have gotten them in the wrong order, but that's what he says. Better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates, the wise man, dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And I think he clearly means that it's not that the human being and Socrates are totally dissatisfied. It's just that they're somewhat dissatisfied because they have more complex and demanding ideas of what pleasures should be in life. So they're willing to tolerate a certain amount of dissatisfaction for the sake of those higher pleasures, and would not trade places with somebody who was totally satisfied but had very low pleasures. That's the idea. I mean, and that's important to see that that's the context of what he's saying there. So other than that, there are two major objections that Mill tries to meet to the greatest happiness principle, or principle of utility. One is that it can't be right because happiness is impossible. And the second is that as regards to the first, he thinks that that is also a misconception of human life. That is to say that happiness is impossible. The only reason to say that is if you have an unrealistic and a unreasonably demanding notion of what constitutes a happiness or a happy life. Of course, we can't be happy all the time. And of course, if you're saying that we should be joyful, rapturous all the time, that's just not going to happen. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Clearly, we have a conception of what a tolerably happy life is. And it's a life that does include joy and intermittent, intense pleasures, but not, constantly. What is important is that you have some degree of comfort and, avoidance of suffering to go along with it. And that's not unrealistic. That, he says, and this is where he turns social reformer, is something that everybody could have, or almost everybody could have, if it weren't for the wretched state of our education and the wretched state of our social arrangements. That is, if people had a decent education that allowed them to enjoy the higher pleasures, they would be happier. And if people had enough money that they didn't have to work 16 hours a day to keep them starving to death, they would be happier, right? So that's why he's some degree of socialism, of course. I mean, almost everybody who was a liberal in those days, in those, days of the 19th century, early 20th century, was something of a socialist. Insofar as they believed that we just had to distribute wealth in a more equitable way in order to prevent human misery and promote human happiness. It's just almost axiomatic. So the second objection that the greatest happiness principle promotes selfishness, because it said just basically do what gives you pleasure, do what makes you feel good. He said that's a total misunderstanding. Of course, I don't mean that, he says. In fact, what I mean is something actually quite demanding. The greatest happiness principle requires that greatest happiness principle, you have to be you have to be neutral. Basically saying, well, of course, your happiness matters. You should preserve your own happiness to the greatest extent, but no more than anyone else's. So that if it turned out that the thing to do to maximize happiness in a given situation caused your unhappiness, you should be willing to do it. Within reason, I guess. So it's not that it promotes selfishness. No, it may be. It requires some degree of altruism. It requires that, therefore, what I mean by altruism, you must be willing to sacrifice your happiness for the sake of others. Not in some sort of needless way, and not to make yourself utterly miserable, but you must be willing to give up some of your happiness for the sake of other people, if that's what the greatest happiness principle demands, right? It's not that you should always have to do it. No, only when it is rational to do it, and it would be rational to do it only when your sacrifice actually promoted the happiness of others in such a way that it outweighed your own unhappiness, right? It's a difficult thing to gauge. So yeah, that question of altruism is basically what leads into chapter 3, where he asks, what is the sanction of principle of utility? I know this is getting to be a long video, but this is the material. So I'm going to just take a little break now, and I'll be right back. I'm back. Okay, so yeah, I know this is a long video, but there's no reason to rush through things. Let's take our time. What is the sanction of the principle of utility? That's, I believe, the title of chapter 3. So, of course, the first step there is, what the heck does sanction mean? I should know that. Sanction. He explains it immediately. What he means by that. Well, I have the book in front of me. Let me quote him. Question is often asked, and properly so, in regard to any supposed moral standard. What is its sanction? What are the motives to obey it? Or more specifically, what is the source of its obligation? Whence does it derive its binding force? Nicely explained. Um, one more way to put it would be what makes it obligatory? Why should I do it? Why does it have any authority over me? Under what conditions? Okay, well, that is that's a serious question. And I think the first, as I said in class, the first thing you need to do after you clear up what he means by sanction is to adjust the principle of utility into something that makes sense, right? Because as we have it here, this is not a rule or a law or a command or an imperative. This is a definition of right and wrong, and then a definition of happiness. There's nothing to follow or not follow. So you have to make it into an imperative. And this is, I would say, a major flaw of the book is he never actually takes the time to do that. I think, as I said in class, it's something that he would find acceptable. It's in the spirit of what he says, is of course, we would add some qualifications about avoiding unhappiness and things like that. But this is the spirit of it. And this is in the form of an imperative or a rule where it would make sense to ask whether it's obligatory. The definition of right and wrong is the question of whether it's obligatory doesn't follow, because there's nothing there that requires us to do anything. Put in this form, and you should always, after reading Kant, you should recognize that this is an imperative. Now the question arises. And the major question is, why should I do that? Why should I not do that, which increases or preserves my own happiness in all circumstances? Why must I be willing to sacrifice my own happiness for the sake of others? And that's a difficult question, right? He knows it's a difficult question. And as he says, this question needs to be asked of all moral theories. Whenever a moral standard or a basic moral principle is proposed, it will always be subject to this question, not just utilitarianism. And he's right, because it is the question of altruism. And anytime we have a morality that's not purely selfish, I suppose there are entirely selfish moralities, but they're usually pretty unsatisfactory, I would say. Any sort of full-blown moral theory will have to deal with the question, the problem of altruism. And yeah, the problem of altruism is in the second question there. Why must I be willing to sacrifice my own happiness for the sake of others? That is altruism. An altruistic act is one in which two things apply. One, that you're sacrificing your own happiness to whatever extent, could be a very small extent. And two, you're doing it for the sake of others. If both of those things don't apply, it's not really altruism. We do things for the sake of others sometimes that makes us happy too. That's not altruism. We sacrifice our own happiness sometimes because we act stupidly, but that's not altruism because you're not doing it for others, right? So both of those things need to be there. And the question is, why should I be altruistic? What obligatory force does that have over me? We saw that with Kant, the way that he approached that, essentially the question of authority. What has authority over me so that it I should be willing to sacrifice my happiness to follow it. And his answer to that is the moral law. Um, the moral law has that kind of status or stature that it can actually oblige me to do things, even if they make me unhappy. And then we could ask, well, why does the moral law have that kind of authority? If that question can be answered within Kant, uh, it has to do with the objective value of the person, the objective value of the idea that myself and others as persons have inherent or intrinsic value. That the value we have is not subjective. That is, it's not dependent upon us being valued by anyone. It's intrinsic value, and it's that intrinsic value that immediately commands my respect. That is, it results in the second categorical imperative that I have to treat such creatures who have objective value always as ends in themselves and never as a mere means to one of my subjective ends. That's Kant's way of dealing with it. That is not Mill's way of dealing with it. His answer to why the principle, ultimately viewed as an imperative, has authority over me is subjective feeling. And what that means is my own subjective feeling. It is tantamount to the question, and the answer to that is I just do. That is, it feels wrong if I hurt them and if I neglect their welfare. That's what he calls conscience. And the basis of conscience is not the recognition of the objective intrinsic value of others. The basis of conscience, again, is subjective feeling. Either you have a feeling for the welfare of others so that you feel bad in making them feel bad, or you feel bad in not doing what is required to avoid their unhappiness and suffering and promote their happiness, or you don't, or you don't, really. So if there were someone who had no fellow feeling, sympathy for his or her fellow human creatures, then there'd be nothing to say to them. So you could say that ultimately the foundation of morality is arbitrary insofar as it depends upon the presence of a feeling that you may or may not have. But part of his argument is that that we are social creatures by nature. We have social instincts. So it's not as if this is not as if this degree of altruism is completely foreign to our nature, but it has to be cultivated in us. We have to have some sort of education for it to grow sufficiently in us. And I think again, this is where he becomes a social reformer again. And we can do that. He actually says it's kind of inevitable as we become more civilized, he said. As societies become more civilized, whatever he means by that, they will naturally more and more the individuals within them and also their political decisions will naturally take the greatest happiness principle into account. So that any legislation, any establishing of social institutions will be done with that in mind. That is, that everybody counts. Basically, that everyone's interests must be taken into account, which doesn't mean we can make everybody happy all the time, but at least, we say that everybody's interests count and everybody's interests count as much as anybody else's. It may be that we have to do things that do make people unhappy, but only in the service of the greatest happiness. Now, this brings up all sorts of problems, of course, in terms of whether it would ever be right to sacrifice anybody for the sake of the greatest happiness. And that's a serious question, and the kind of question we'll be taking up further on into the semester.